The fall of the communist regime of Nicolae Ceaușescu in Romania is an example of how political theory and desires can become divorced from reality. The transition from Romanian communism to a new democracy is a more unusual case than is often believed when studying political transitions in history. That's why I invite you to join me today to learn about the rise and fall of Romanian communism and the all-powerful Nicolae Ceaușescu. To understand the fall of Ceaușescu's Romanian regime, the first thing we need to know is what 20th century communist Romania was like and how that nation reached such a critical point in 1989. Romania, located between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea, became a modern state in the 19th century after freeing itself from the orbit of the Ottoman Empire. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was a nation shaped by its rural character. It was a society where, like many other peoples, power tended to become personalized, where in times of instability, the Romanian people tended to seek strong leaders who could guarantee order and peace. This was reflected in even extravagant figures like Vlad the Impaler or Michael the Brave, who became the archetype of the ideal prince, a figure who not only rules, but also protects and punishes. During the interwar period in Europe between 1918 and 1939, Romania formally functioned as a constitutional monarchy. It had a modern constitution, a bicameral parliament, and established political parties such as the National Liberal Party and the National Peasant Party. On paper, the country seemed aligned with Western models, especially the French one, with a centralized state and an elite that looked to the West, especially Europe, as the political model. But the truth is that this modernity was largely superficial. On one hand, the base of the country was not only still rural, but also lived in very precarious conditions, with high levels of illiteracy and without access to many of the services or opportunities considered typical of 20th century modernity. The institutions existed, but they didn't always work as expected. That is, there were modern structures, but without a solution that fully supported them. That fragility became evident in the 1930s. An economic crisis hit Romania. Social instability and the rise of extreme ideologies gradually eroded that party-based democracy. Movements like the Iron Guard began gaining prominence, and in 1938 King Carol II decided to shut down the system, dissolve the parties, and established a royal dictatorship, concentrating power in his own hands. However, it was World War II that ended up destabilizing everything. Romania tried to remain neutral in that conflict, but in 1940 it was forced to cede territories to the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Bulgaria. That loss of territory caused great discontent, which materialized when Marshal Ion Antonescu took power and established a military dictatorship in Romania, aligned with Nazi Germany. Under his command, Romania took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, recovering what was lost in the conflict. Even so, with the advance of the Red Army in 1944, the young King Michael I of Romania led a coup d'etat on August 23, arresting Antonescu and aligning the country with the Allies. In this attempt, they also sought to save what was left of the country. From this moment on, the Soviet presence became decisive in Romania. The troops of the Soviet Union not only occupy the territory, they also influence internal politics. And here a key player emerges: the Romanian Communist Party, a small party with fewer than 1,000 members, which on its own did not have the real capacity to take power. But what it lacked in numbers, it had in support, political, economic, and above all, military, from the Soviet Union. With Soviet tutelage, the communists began to organize the Romanian state as well as infiltrate it. They gradually displaced their opponents and consolidated their positions. In 1945, under direct pressure from Moscow, the government of Petru Groza was imposed in Romania. Then came the 1946 elections, where the National Peasant Party was displaced. And from there, the process was quick and systematic. For communist and Soviet hegemony, parties are legalized, opponents are arrested, and any form of organized dissent is dismantled. Finally, on December 30, 1947, King Mihai is forced to abdicate. With his departure, the last symbol of the old order disappeared. The monarchy had just fallen, and the Romanian People's Republic was proclaimed. But the truth is that this change is not the result of an internal revolution in Romania, but rather, as we saw in the post-war agreements, the Western powers accepted that Romania would remain under the influence of the Soviet Union. Thus, without external support and facing a decisive military presence, the dissident forces in Romania will have no real room to maneuver. And in this way, communist Romania began. Under this Soviet communism, Romania undergoes a radical transformation. The economy is nationalized, private property progressively disappears, and the countryside is subjected to forced collectivization that breaks the traditional agricultural fabric of the nation, which went beyond just the economy. For a deeply rural society, this was not just an economic change, but a cultural rupture. The peasant, who had been the symbolic core of the Romanian nation, is now turned into a cog in the state machinery. Many will resist, and that resistance comes at a high price: deportations, prison, and forced labor. At the same time, a state apparatus is built around the Securitate, created in 1948. It's not just a secret police, it's an instrument of constant surveillance that will generate fear among the population. This will be the secret police that will neutralize dissent, not only with constant surveillance, but also with punishment when necessary. Intellectuals, former politicians, priests, anyone who represented any threat to power was dealt with in some way. Experiments like the one in Pitești, where they tried to re-educate prisoners, are an example of some of the methods used during this regime. And yet, while all this is happening, a rapid industrialization is also being pushed forward in Romania. The cities keep growing, factories are emerging, and a new working class is rising in the country, starting to replace the old rural world. It's a violent, chaotic, but effective process. Structurally, Romania is transformed in less than 2 decades. At the center of this system is Gheorghe Dej, a man shaped by party discipline, distrustful, pragmatic, and deeply marked by the logic of power. It's striking that his leadership is consolidated by eliminating internal rivals, especially the faction closest to the Soviet leadership in Moscow. And here's an important nuance. Although the regime is Stalinist in its methods, by the late 1950s, it begins to seek a certain autonomy from the Soviet Union. Now, for the average Romanian citizen, these geopolitical tensions mattered little or not at all. Everyday life was marked by precariousness, state control, occasional periods of scarcity, and uncertainty. Moreover, in that climate without political freedom, a need began to grow among the Romanian people, the need for a different kind of leadership, less submissive to Moscow and more connected to the idea of the nation and the well-being of the people. No specific figure had emerged yet, but the psychological groundwork was already laid. When Gheorghe Dej dies in 1965, the system seeks that continuity, but also a renewal. That's when a name appears that at first seemed minor within the party structure, but he would prove to the others that he was different: Nicolae Ceaușescu. But who is Nicolae Ceaușescu? Before becoming the absolute face of power in Romania, Nicolae Ceaușescu was essentially a disciplined member of the communist apparatus. Born in 1918 in Scornicesti, into a poor peasant family, he left that rural world very early to seek a living in Bucharest as a shoemaker's apprentice. On the outskirts of the city, he came into contact with the underground communist movement at a time when the party was illegal and persecuted. His youth was marked by constant arrests, years in prison, and a life of silent conspiracy where instead of standing out, he learned to obey, endure, and wait. But the decisive moment happened in prison. There he met Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, who would become his mentor and the figure who would shape his career. Ceaușescu, more than an ideologue or a charismatic leader, was at first an organizer, an operator, a leader of the party's internal apparatus. And in that communist and Soviet system, that was more valuable than any speech or charisma. When Gheorghiu Dej died in 1965, Ceaușescu emerged as a compromise figure among the different factions of power. He was conciliatory and also seemed manageable. Young, without a dominant profile, although he already controlled something key: the apparatus of the main party officials. With his cunning and a particular charisma in private, he had placed his men and had quietly built his own base, formally assuming the presidency of Romania on December 9, 1967. And his first major political breakthrough came in front of the people on August 21, 1968, from the balcony of the party's Central Committee, where he strongly condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. That day, he stopped being just another bureaucrat and began to emerge as the leader of a structure that would last for a long time until his death. Ceaușescu built his power on a formula that seemed to resolve an old Romanian tension, being communist without giving up national identity. His doctrine, the so-called national communism, combined independence from Moscow with a historical narrative that portrayed Romania as an exceptional civilization. When in 1968 he condemned the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the country saw him as a leader who protected national sovereignty, who would not let himself be trampled by the great powers. That moment gave him real support and opened an initial period where there was a certain cultural respite and a sense of regained dignity. But that symbolic capital soon turned into something else. Ceaușescu was becoming not just a leader, but the very embodiment of the state itself. He goes from being a disciplined militant to a leader convinced of his own exceptionalism. And on the material front, the regime transforms the country. Monumental works like the People's House are built, heavy industry expands, and key infrastructure is constructed. But the truth is that this development comes with a disproportionate cost: demolition of historic neighborhoods, forced displacement of rural populations, and inefficient projects that consume more than they produce. And yet, for a time, many Romanians accept and even support this sacrifice, believing in the promise of modernity. But this is a relationship that breaks down in the 1980s. The decision to pay off the foreign debt at any cost, combined with a stagnant economic system, introduced a level of austerity that had not been seen in many of the early periods of Ceaușescu. Now there were more rationings, it was cold in the homes, and there were constant blackouts. The state, in turn, became more intrusive in political and social matters. The Securitate infiltrated daily life, pursuing whoever it deemed necessary. Decree 770, which prohibits abortion, a right enshrined in several Soviet countries. And in the midst of all these conflicts, official propaganda insists on a golden age, but hardly anyone recognized it in their daily experience. All of this, it should be said, happened amid the major global changes that were reshaping not just the financial system, but also culture and geopolitics in the 1970s and 1980s. Sociologically, in Romania, that bond between the leader and the people was also breaking down. Strikes occurred in 1977 and 1987, which revealed the cracks in that system. Ceaușescu, for his part, at the height of his power, became increasingly isolated. He was skeptical of several of the reforms that were spreading throughout Eastern Europe, and that state, which seemed to be frozen in time, began to crack in 1989. The collapse of the Ceaușescu regime did not happen suddenly, but rather its various sources of legitimacy and power, both external and internal, were gradually exhausted. For years, Romania had survived as, quote, an independent island within the communist bloc, unquote, and had also managed to get along with the West because of its relative distance from Moscow. But that usefulness to the West disappeared with the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 as the leader of the Soviet Union. The so-called Sinatra Doctrine, which was the idea that each country should do it their own way, deactivated the old principle of Soviet intervention within the Soviet model. While the rest of Eastern Europe was liberalizing and trying out reforms, Ceaușescu believed that those reforms would mean the end of socialism in the world. He rejected Russian perestroika and Soviet glasnost, considered them ideological deviations, tightened internal control in Romania, and refused to accept the changes happening in the world. The West, which used to tolerate him, began to see his regime as an awkward fit for the interests of the New World Order that was being established. So the United States is also going to withdraw its backing and support, but the real collapse is brewing inside the country. In the 1980s, Ceaușescu made a decision that would change everything. He decided to pay off the foreign debt, which was about $10 billion in the shortest time possible. And although he succeeded, the cost of this was devastating. Agricultural production stagnates, basic foods are rationed, electricity is systematically cut off, and heating disappears in the middle of winter. The numbers are telling. Domestic consumption collapses, while the state boasts of financial balance. The population survives under conditions of structural scarcity. Thus, the regime no longer offers well-being. Added to this is a project launched by Ceaușescu called systematization, which aimed to redesign the country from the top down. Thousands of Romanian villages now had to disappear in order to concentrate the population in apartment blocks. For a society with those roots, this was a very problematic public policy. What would happen next, that December of 1989, cannot be explained as a simple popular uprising or as a palace coup. It was a convergence of internal and external factors that determined its course. It can be said that the events marking the last days of communism in Romania began in the city of Timișoara on December 16, 1989. Without a master plan behind it, the spark that ignites all of this is the Romanian state's attempt to evict the Christian pastor Laszlo Tokes in order to move him from his parish to the north of the country. At first, the parishioners defend the religious leader, and within a matter of hours, that particular cause will turn into a widespread protest against the regime itself. The revolt grows and spreads across society, first among minorities, then workers, then students, and many young people who had never known anything other than communism. Some of the contingents sent to suppress the protests blend in with the demonstrators. The Romanian regime loses part of its functional base in just a few days. The initial reaction is repression. The Securitate always acts the way I saw yesterday. But unlike other times, the political police start to fragment as some sectors begin to disobey their own superiors. Others begin to have doubts, and the police chief himself, Julian Blatt, starts to act ambiguously. At the same time, General Victor Stanculescu, who is the chief of staff, orders the troops to withdraw from the protests. And with that, in practice, he cedes control of public space. The soldiers no longer fire, and people become emboldened. The decisive moment happens on December 21st. Ceaușescu calls for a large demonstration in Bucharest to show support for the regime. For the first time during a live broadcast, the crowd boos him.
The people of Bucharest, considering this, what's happening? What?
His hesitant, bewildered reaction breaks the aura of authority built over decades. The next day, after the death of the Minister of Defense under unclear circumstances, the chain of command in the state and the Romanian army is broken. There was no longer any armed force to guarantee public order or the regime's hold on power, or to stop what had been set in motion. On December 22, Ceaușescu and his wife flee in a helicopter from the Central Committee building, while the crowd takes to the streets. But shortly after, they are captured in Târgoviște, where they had fled. The center of power had shifted, now centered around the National Salvation Front, led by Ion Iliescu, a former member of the communist apparatus. The decision reached by those now in power is swift. They decide that the dictator had to be eliminated in order to prevent him from becoming a symbol of resistance. In this way, on December 25, 1989, a summary trial lasting barely an hour is held. Nicolae Ceaușescu is accused of genocide, with inflated figures of up to 60,000 victims. He is accused of destroying the economy and of illicit enrichment. Ceaușescu does not recognize the court that is judging him. Even so, the decision of the court of those in power is final. Ceaușescu and his wife are sentenced to death. After the trial, they are recorded on camera while their hands are tied by soldiers. Nicolae, once all-powerful, kept telling the guards, "I am the commander-in-chief of the army," while shouting long live the Socialist Republic. His wife clung to him, saying they had the right to die together. And while she struggled with the guards, she reminded them that she was the First Lady of Romania. Ceaușescu and his wife are taken to the courtyard of the old military barracks in Târgoviște with tears in their eyes. The presidential couple knows their execution by firing squad is imminent. Standing side by side in front of one of the courtyard walls, Ceaușescu and his wife are executed by a volley of more than 100 shots. The dramatic scene that was recorded is seen around the world. It is the abrupt and definitive end of one of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe. But what will follow at the internal level is not a clean break. The new regime established in Romania, led by the National Salvation Front, maintains many continuities with the previous system, especially regarding the men who will lead it. There appears, as we said, Ion Iliescu, a man from the previous system, not at all a stranger to it, who worked alongside the so-called king of communism. However, the Soviet order had already ended, and in Romania the cycle was closing irreversibly. The elimination of the leaders aimed to ensure that there was no possible return. And although later on, armed groups in favor of the communist regime of the late Ceaușescu were formed, the effectiveness of these groups was very limited and did not lead to any change. What happened in Romania is different from the fall of other socialist regimes at that time. There was no negotiated transition like in the Soviet Union, because no reform was possible within Ceaușescu's system, as he was determined to maintain his system. His rigidity makes him unable to adapt, and when the international context changes, the regime is completely exposed. It's not a complete purge of the apparatus, but rather a reconfiguration. More than one Romanian perceives that the revolution was actually taken over by the second line of command of the old communist power. This paves the way for a formally democratic republic with elections and pluralism, but still marked by the inertia of the old system. The legacy of Ceaușescu thus remains caught in a contradiction. On one hand, the memory of terror, scarcity, and repression. On the other hand, a persistent nostalgia that, according to surveys, has led more than 60% of the Romanian population to believe that life before 1989 offered better living conditions and was more stable. The fall of Ceaușescu was driven by discontent and an internal popular revolution. Nevertheless, at its core, it was an implosion controlled by sectors of the apparatus itself, who sacrificed the leader to preserve their positions of power in the new order. What came afterward brought new freedoms, but also several new economic and social problems that were not as pronounced before, such as lack of housing and unemployment. Many are satisfied with the benefits brought by the new Romania, while for many other Romanians the question of what was truly gained and what was lost during and after Nicolae Ceaușescu still lingers in their memory. Thank you all very much for watching this video. Just a reminder, you can really support us by leaving your comments, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with everyone, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reinaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.